In the last lecture, we talked about some of the more basic refresh and data source options, but now I want to share 2 pro tips that are really helpful when you're working with dynamic or growing source data. So back in our IMDb movie database file, you'll remember that the last tip that I showed you was to simply stack or append new data into rows beneath the existing range. In this case, we added a fake title called sample title in row 3727, and from there we had to go back into the pivot table tools and change the data source manually to capture that new data. But the fact is there are more efficient ways to accomplish this same task. First option is to remove the row numbers from our source reference, which will essentially tell Excel to pull in any rows from within those columns so that you can simply refresh rather than adjusting that reference each time. And so in our tools, I'm going to go into change data source, and all I'm going to do is remove the fixed reference to row 1 and the reference to row 3727 so that I'm left with a column only reference. And again, this just means that Excel will be looking at any cells contained within columns A through R, no matter how many rows down they fall. So when I press OK, you may notice one change, which is that a new row appears with a blank. And again, that's just because now our source data, scrolling down, doesn't end at the last row with data in it. It extends all the way down to all rows in the worksheet, which obviously includes some blanks. So the benefit of doing this is that now when I stack data underneath my existing data, like sample title 2 for instance, now I don't have to manually change the range. I can just hit refresh, and as you can see, sample title 2 pops up. I can do the same thing with sample title 3, refresh, there it is. So it certainly saves some time taking that approach. Now the second option, which is even more efficient and a bit more scalable, is to format our source data as a table rather than a range. And the difference, looking at our movie database tab, is that a range to Excel is simply some collection of data points or cells across rows and columns, whereas a table can be named and referenced as a self-contained unit. And one really nice benefit of tables is that they can adapt and grow automatically as you stack more data. So to show you that, why don't we just get rid of these 3 rows with our sample titles. And I'm going to scroll all the way to the top. And what we're going to do is select cell A1. I'm going to use the Control Shift arrow right, arrow down shortcut, which contains all of the cells within my range. And up here in the home menu, I'm just going to choose Format as Table. And I'll pick the format I like. I'm just going to choose this first one. And it says, okay, where's the data? And it defaults to the selection that I just made. And I check the box that says, yes, my table does have headers right here in row 1. And when I press OK, you can see that it's formatted it as a table, and it's launched this new option called Table Tools. And within the Table Tools, I can give this table a name, and let's just call it Movies. And what's great about this is that now I can go back into my pivot, I can go into the change data source options, and instead of a traditional range reference like this, I can simply type the name of the table, movies. And when I press OK, you can see that I still have all the same data, all the same fields, values, everything. It's just that now movies refers to all of the same data in the form of the table on the IMDb movie database tab. So we've simplified the reference, which is great, but the added benefit is that now I can stack data and it will automatically be absorbed into that table. And to show you how this works, I have a second Excel file called 2016 Movies, and this is available for download in the course resources if you choose to follow along. But basically this is just a fictional set of additional movies that we can use to practice stacking onto our existing IMDb database. So we've got some new movies that were released in 2016 that aren't captured in our current data set. So all I would need to do is select all of my data here in rows 2 through 9. I can do this because I know that my column headers match exactly. And if I just copy from this workbook and go to my movie database tab with my table, watch how cool this is. If I select A3727, I use Control V to paste that new data, you can see that it's been absorbed into the table itself. So I don't have to redefine the table, change any source references. Those new rows have just become part of the table. And that way in the Pivot tab, just like before, all I need to do is hit refresh. And there you go, you'll see all of those new rows that were added to the table. Now if you want to get really advanced, you can take this a step further and actually populate this table based on a link to an external data source like a SQL table or a view that can refresh or update automatically. But for our purposes here, this will certainly get the job done. Now let's say you change your mind and you don't want this to be formatted as a table anymore. All you need to do is go back into your table tools and click this Convert to Range button. And when you do that, click Yes. Essentially we now just have a range of data again. Even though it maintained the formatting of the table, these cells are now technically just part of a range. And when we do that, we have to go back into our pivot. When we change our data source, you can see that it's no longer referencing that table name called movies. It's now defaulted to referencing the actual range from A1 through R3734. So there you go. 2 more efficient ways to deal with dynamic or growing source data using pivot tables.